Hello and welcome, everyone. We are so glad that you're able to join us today. My name is Morgan Whitmer. I'm a PhD candidate in political theory at the Catholic University of America, and I'm also a graduate fellow of the Institute for Human Ecology. Before we begin, I'd like to say a quick word about the event sponsor, the Institute for Human Ecology. The Institute for Human Ecology is the nation's leading academic institute committed to identifying the cultural, economic, and social conditions vital for human flourishing. Drawing on the Catholic intellectual tradition, the mission of the IHE is to educate students, sponsor multidisciplinary research, advise church leadership, and organize symposia, conferences, and lectures for the Academy and the public square. One quick housekeeping item. If you'd like to ask a question, please submit a question at any time through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we'll pose as many questions as time permits during the Q&A portion. I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's event. Luke Foster completed his PhD in the University of Chicago's Committee on Social Thought, where he completed a political theory dissertation on elite education in democracy entitled Excellence for the Democratic Age, Liberal Education and the Mixed Regime. Born in Malawi and raised in Mozambique, he completed a BA in English and History at Columbia University. From 2020 to 2022, a visiting research fellow at Sciences Po Paris, he is currently a postdoctoral research scholar at the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government at the University of Notre Dame. An alumni of the IHE's 2018 Civitas Dei Fellowship, he has published articles in American Political Thought, the Tocqueville Review, and the Political Science Reviewer, and is currently revising his dissertation into a book manuscript entitled Excellence for the Democratic Age, the Liberal Arts and the Mixed Regime. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Luke for his talk, Miseducation of Foreign Policy Elites, Tocqueville and Babbitt on Refining Judgment.
Thank you very much, Morgan, for that very generous introduction, and to the IHE for making today's event possible, and for all that history of excellent programming that Morgan has referred to. So I should preface what I have to say here today by acknowledging my expertise is not in foreign policy, far from it. I approach these things, really from the theoretical angle with all of the limitations that implies. And this interest, this work came out of the broader project that Morgan's alluded to on the education of elites in democracy, and particularly thinking about areas where disproportionate skill or expertise, knowledge is valuable, even in a system, even in a regime, which we legitimate based on the sort of the equal authority of each citizen. And foreign policy, comes to mind quickly as one of the kind of the key areas where it's really hard to deny that there's a need for specific knowledge and skills and experience. And also, this is, of course, why in the American context, in the context of many different republics and democracies, foreign policy tends to be a bit insulated from directly democratic judgment. Right? And so it occurred to me in thinking with and about Irving, Babbitt, and Tocqueville's writing on elite education more broadly, that they might shed some light on recent problems in American foreign policy and help us maybe develop a framework for what a better version of training of foreign policy elites could be. Right? So again, that's the interest. That's what I hope to contribute here. With all of the caveats and the limitations of my knowledge that implies. So what I'd like to do is give you a quick PowerPoint, which draws really on it takes a starting point from the catastrophe of the last 21 years of American policy in Afghanistan, offering, thinking with some of the problems that experience has thrown up in a way that's hopefully deeper and better than the kind of typical response we get in the commentariat, which I think is sometimes has some contradictory impulses. So I take as my opening provocation this very interesting series of interviews that Andrew Duran did, anonymized, with American servicemen who'd spent time in Afghanistan, reflecting really in an interestingly philosophical, liberal artsy way on the reasons for the futility they felt, these service members felt in the American effort. And so these are quotations from the interviews with a soldier, putting into historical comparative perspective the American effort in Afghanistan, thinking of it frankly as an imperial project in comparison with other empires in history. And the interviewee's remarks are a bit inflammatory or colorful at times, but I'll just read them. You have them here on the screen as well. So he says, we were trying to build a culture, but how the hell can you build a culture when we have nothing to contribute to them culturally, when we have no civilization to impart? What we tried was essentially the Roman model. The Romans built roads, but didn't try to impress their culture upon the conquered. The Greeks, by contrast, brought their ideas with them. And he's taken as his starting point in these remarks the experience of Alexander's conquests into the Persian Empire and into what's now Afghanistan. He goes on, we were there writing checks and shooting people. It was as incoherent to me as it was to the Afghans. But building a soccer field isn't building a civilization. The foundations for civilization, for reason, for the common good, for law, for science, all of it was missing. It's still missing, and no one seems to have a sense of how to build it. And so what I get from this in part is a sense that mere technical expertise, mere knowledge of means, without a sense of worthy ends for rule or the principles of action, has this kind of futile effect, right? You can pour lots of concrete into a piece of terrain, but it doesn't actually leave a kind of a lasting mark on a society in anything other than simple violence. Right. And so here he compares it to the British experience in the 19th century. The last quote on your screen. If I'd been part of the British Navy in the 19th century, civilizing would have been part of our mission. But for us, it was dialoguing about nothing, about projects, using words that mean nothing. Sustainability, dynamism, governance, implementation, transparent, relevant, outreach, consolidate, force multiplier, cross-pollinate, trust gap, legitimacy, capitalize, mobilize, incentivize, mandate, aftermathing, liaisoning, conflict mapping, indices, unity of action. You see what I mean? The antiseptic PowerPoint sociology speech. So this in a way moves the critique to a deeper level, right? Where he's saying that not only was the kind of mere imposition of material power futile and shallow, when the American authorities did try to go deeper and give some sense of principle, some kind of articulate justification for what they were doing, it tends to be this kind of mixture of corporate and university bureaucracy speak, which doesn't actually touch anyone or persuade anyone, among its other problems, right? Great. So what are kind of the takeaways we could draw out of this analysis, right? And I'm giving you this interview kind of as a touchstone for thinking about a lot of the things that have been said by various pundits to explain the failures in Afghanistan, right? So on one level, something I think we hear in Duran's interviews, and that I think we hear tossed around a lot, is a kind of simple hubris, right? The American invaders overestimated their capacity and underestimated how difficult their mission was, right? So, this would be a kind of a classical way of thinking, going back at least to Thucydides and others on the failures of empire, about just pride, arrogance, right? And there's definitely something to that. I think a step deeper, or a slightly more nuanced explanation for failure is to say, well, the Americans assumed that their experience rebuilding Germany and Japan after World War II would translate neatly into nation building in Afghanistan, and so didn't fully reckon with the ways in which history and culture make different contexts very particular, and things that worked in one place run into maybe fatal obstacles at another, right? And this, I think, again, has a lot to recommend it. There's a certain characteristic naivete, perhaps, that we have as Americans in assuming that our way of doing things just is the obvious or universally self-evident way. And there's a third, which, I mean, at times, Joseph, the interviewee in that last quote, seems to suggest, which cuts against the previous two to an extent. And that's to say, the actual things that America was trying to achieve were too small, in a way, right? The objectives themselves were relatively petty and inadequate reasons to spend all the blood and treasure of an invasion, both American and Afghan blood, right? And that would suggest that to do this kind of thing entails higher or more noble goals, right? Which might, in practice, be at odds with worrying about hubris, right? You might think that the greater, more difficult the goal you set for yourself, the more likely you are to hubristically overestimate your capacities, right? So what I want to do in the remainder of this talk is point to these two authors who reflect on the education of leaders and the characteristic weaknesses of democracy along these three lines. So Irving Babbitt I'm taking to address points 1 and 2, hubris and ignorance, and then Tocqueville, somewhat in tension with Babbitt, I'm going to take to address this pettiness problem, and then the third heading. So Irving Babbitt was a Harvard professor of classics in the early 20th century. Enjoyed teaching literature, relatively quiet career, but he wrote some quite stinging denunciations of both the kind of emerging hyper-specialized research university in the early 20th century, at Harvard in particular, and something that he saw as kind of a problem in parallel with this overly scientific model of the university, which was a kind of hubristically Wilsonian foreign policy. And so he writes his most political book, Democracy and Leadership, really as a response to the Treaty of Versailles and his frustration with Wilson. So he says paradoxically that there is something inherently imperial in the democratic spirit, that if we think of democracy badly as simply the individual's freedom to do as he or she likes, that inherently doesn't have restraining or constraining principles. It tends to overflow. And so a democratic polity has a tendency, he thinks, to continually expand and imposes its will on others in a way that perhaps contradicts, the democratic aspirations of those societies. So he says, the outcome of yielding to a mere expansive conceit of the emotions, that's this anarchic self picture, is not fraternity, but a decadent imperialism. One finds behind every other form of imperialism, the imperialism or push for power of the individual. So here, Babbitt has a controversial, bold ascription of kind of the guilt of imperialism at the national or political scale to this kind of tyrannical impulse in the psyche. Right? He wants to kind of individualize it, and he's very worried about what he sees in Wilson, in John Dewey, many of the kind of American progressive intellectuals of the era of World War I, his aspiration for kind of scientific, technical management of world affairs. And this is the aspiration of the war to end all wars and the League of Nations in his mind. It's actually to impose the will of a cadre of American technocrats on very different societies around the world. So even as he's warned against pure democracy, he also wants to warn against certain kinds of oligarchy. And so he says, one cannot grant that an aristocracy of scientific intellectuals, or indeed any aristocracy of intellect, is what we need. This would mean practically to encourage the libido sciendi, and so to put pride in the place of humility. So again, this is addressing the hubris piece we saw earlier. Still less acceptable would be an aristocracy of artists, as the word art has come to be understood in recent times. This would mean an aristocracy of aesthetes, who would attempt to base their selection on the libido sentiendi, the lust of feeling. The Nietzschean attempt, again, to found the aristocratic and selective principle on the sheer expansion of the will to power, libido dominandi, would lead in practice to horrible violence and finally to the death of civilization. So, Babbitt is doing this complex, rapid fire thing where he's sort of, he almost makes it seem like everything from Wilson to the Nazis is on a straightforward continuum, right? which might be a little unfair. Let's look then at what his sort of positive educational program is in terms of dealing with this hubristic and overly technocratic to the ignorance of history and culture formation that he thinks American leaders have. So his big target in his other big book, Literature in the American College, is the elective system. The system we now take for granted of, students have a major and then they have a lot of other optional courses they can take, and basically it's up to their individual judgment what they choose to expose themselves to. There are none or very few kind of required mandatory classes. So for Babbitt, this is, as in foreign policy, is the fusion of a kind of Rousseauian anarchy of individual impulses with a spirit that comes from Francis Bacon of scientific technical control of nature, even at the cost of mutilating nature. Right. So in the first quote, which I won't read, he's targeting Charles Eliot, the president of Harvard, who came up with the elective system. What does he want to propose instead? Well, it turns out to be a literary and kind of an inculcation in a tradition through texts that is supposed to restrain the hubristic side of the hubristic impulses that highly intellectually gifted people might otherwise have. So he says, education should be less infected than it is with a pedantic straining after originality. The college's function is not, as is so often assumed, merely to help its students to self-expression, but even more to help them become humane. And then he goes on to say this implies a humane standard to which the student may defer, that will help him to discriminate between what is truly original and what is merely freakish and abnormal in himself and others. This humane standard may be gained by a few through philosophic insight, but in most cases it will be attained, if at all, by knowledge of good literature, by familiarity with that golden chain of masterpieces which links together into a single tradition the more permanent experience of the race. And by that he means the human race, right? That he means that there are lessons and experiences, like, for instance, the hubristic grasping after power and coming up short, which are universal, which throughout time and history, those who have been wise and reflective have run into and have therefore written down for us, and being inculcated in that tradition, the tradition of texts like that, can help perhaps help people second guess their ambitions. All right, so that's Babbitt on the first two problems. I want to turn now to Tocqueville on the third, and I think much bigger, maybe more interesting problem of a pusillanimous kind of under-ambitious goal for foreign policy. Right? So Tocqueville talks like this frequently, actually, in saying that the problem, one of the greatest and most subtle difficulties democracies have, is that they tend to set too limited objectives for themselves. They can even debase the human spirit or the human soul by making people too comfortable with sort of everyday petty material security and wealth. So he appeals frequently to leaders, statesmen, politicians, with claims like this. So this is from Volume 2, Democracy in America. Legislators in democracies and all honest and enlightened men who live in democracies must apply themselves without respite to lifting up souls and keeping them pointed towards heaven. It is necessary that all those who are interested in the future of democratic societies unite to spread within these societies the taste for the infinite, the sentiment for the grand, and the love for non-material pleasures. All right, so what might that look like in practice? And this is, I think, to our sensibilities today, as somewhat disturbing or startling aspect of Tocqueville's thought. But he addresses war and the difficulty of keeping militaries loyal to democracies. Right? So he says later on in Volume 2, the ever-increasing number of property owners friendly to peace, the development of personal wealth, which war so rapidly devours, this leniency of morals, this softness of heart, this predisposition towards pity that equality inspires, this coldness of reason that makes men hardly sensitive to the poetic and violent emotions which arise among arms, all these causes join together to extinguish military spirit. Right? And, Tocqueville really views this as a double-edged sword, right? It's a kind of democratic peace theory, you might think. It's obviously, on the whole, much better that people use their inclinations in productive and peaceful ways rather than in violence. But he thinks there's a danger of completely forgetting and neglecting the martial virtues or the military side of human affairs. So he goes on to say, I do not want to speak ill of war. War almost always enlarges the thought of a people, and elevates the heart. There are cases where it alone can arrest the excessive development of certain tendencies that arise naturally from equality, and where war must be considered as necessary for certain inveterate illnesses to which democratic societies are subject. Right? So that's startling, maybe a little troubling. Another source of greatness that Tocqueville points to, and that he's really keen to preserve, is classical education. And for him, this means the Greek and Roman classics principally. And so he goes on to say, this is quite clearly addressed to an elite few whom he thinks will have a disproportionate role in governing. Greek and Latin must not be taught in all schools, but it is important those destined by their nature or their fortune to cultivate letters or predisposed to appreciate them find schools where they can perfectly master ancient literature and be thoroughly penetrated by its spirit. A few excellent universities will be worth more to achieve this goal than a multitude of bad colleges where superfluous studies done badly prevent necessary ones from being done well. All right. So again, this is this is a frankly elitist aspect to Tocqueville, even as much as he celebrates democracy. And he goes on to give us kind of more of a hint of the specific curriculum when talking about Plato and why the Platonic texts have sort of survived. He says, in every age, there are immaterialists and materialists. Plato, like we moderns, had to debate people who thought that the body was all there was and the soul had no value. But he says the deeper instincts of the human heart are against this, and so Plato survived even when the pre-Socratics he argued with didn't. And the lesson he draws from this is, it must not be believed that in any time, in whatever political state, the passion for material enjoyments and the opinions that are linked with it will be able to suffice for an entire people. The heart of man is more vast than you suppose. It can at the same time enclose the taste for the good things of the earth and the love of the good things of heaven. Sometimes the heart seems to give itself madly to one of the two, but it never goes for a long time without thinking of the other. Right? So what kind of concrete political form would this desire for greatness, this kind of nourishing of magnanimous impulse on great texts, what would its practical expression be? Right? I mean, Tocqueville talks about several things, right? He talks about religion, of course. He talks about art, public monuments, some kind of great public projects that people feel like they're contributing to. We might think of, in America, our imagination probably goes readily to something like the space program of the 1960s. But Tocqueville also, of course, was practically involved in the French conquest and colonial project in Algeria. And he did view this kind of imperial mission as one of the avenues this could take. So this is a bit, again, I think startling to us today, but it relates back to Durand's article that I started with. Tocqueville, in a way, thinks like Samuel Huntington in terms of taking different civilizations and their institutions, their what he calls mores, their kind of deep customs and habits, as not determining. He insists that human beings are free and can self-fashion to an extent, but to have a kind of deep path dependency of the political possibilities open in different to different peoples and different places at any given time. So the famous picture in the introduction to Democracy in America about the sort of advent of democracy as this sort of inevitable providential force is very clearly addressed to Christendom. He says this is he'll say at another point that Jesus Christ had to become man in order to teach us that we were all equal, right? So that the deep instinct on a moral level for equality, he thinks, is not natural, but it's a consequence of the incarnation. And so he will claim that Christian people seem to me to offer today a frightening spectacle. The movement that sweeps them along is already so strong that it cannot be suspended, and is not yet so rapid as to despair of directing it. Their fate is in their hands, but soon it escapes them. Right. So this is the claim that this leveling tendency towards equality is distinctively felt in the Christian world. He doesn't celebrate that unequivocally. He thinks it's going to bring serious problems with it. But what's interesting for our purposes today is that Tocqueville, as a practical politician, both as a deputy under the July monarchy and the Second Republic, supported the Algerian colonial project on grounds of this kind of civilizing project of expanding the realm in which these democratic and free institutions that he valued could take root. And he viewed that as, again, in contrast with Durand's article on Afghanistan, he viewed that as a long-term, deep, difficult project of addressing and changing the customs of people on the ground. Right. So he said this is from a speech in the National Assembly in 1845. But he claimed if France were governed as she ought to be, she would sense that her principal interest, her permanent interest, is to make liberal institutions triumph in the world, not only out of love for these institutions, but even out of care for her strength and grandeur. The great interest of France is to replace despotic institutions with liberal ones everywhere. This, I dare say, is France's capital interest. And this, by the way, there's the context of the speech is a sort of rebuke to those who would want to ally permanently with the British. There's definitely a kind of Franco-English rivalry aspect to all of this, right? But it's interesting for what it reveals about this claim that a country like France cannot be content to keep free institutions for itself. It has to have a mission to spread them. All right. In conclusion, I just want to say that Tocqueville is aware of Babbitt's worries about trying to do this hubristically, right? And he sees this, I think he sees the temptation as a return to paganism, right? Which is sort of, for him, the love of domination, this kind of cruel aristocratic hierarchy that is simply lording it over other people for the sake of it, right? And so he says this about the Romans, but it's a theme throughout his writings. At the time of their greatest enlightenment, the Romans cut the throats of enemy generals after dragging them in triumph behind a chariot and delivered prisoners to the beasts to the amusement of the people. Cicero, who raises such loud cries at the idea of a citizen crucified, finds nothing to say about these atrocious abuses of victory. It is clear that in his eyes, a foreigner is not of the same human species as a Roman. Right. So this is sort of a profound statement of disappointment in one of his heroes, Cicero, for having such a narrow circle of moral concern. It doesn't extend to humanity as a whole. It extends only to his fellow citizens, right? And of course, and the implications of this for empire are pretty obvious. So he will say in his long form study of Algerian policy, he has some very stern words for the French army, and he's pointing out that this sort of idea of a civilizing mission or a civilizational standard is easy to lose in practice in the course of a conquest, right? So he says, we are now fighting far more barbarously than the Arabs themselves. For the present, it is on their side that one meets with civilization. This manner of conducting war seems to me as unintelligent as it is cruel. It was certainly not worth taking the place of the Turks as rulers of Algeria to recreate that aspect of their rule that deserved the world's abhorrence. Right? So in these passages, right, I think that Tocqueville anticipates a really profound worry that whatever good this kind of civilizational spreading of free institutions, foreign policy might seek to do, it's often undermined in practice by the very pride that it cultivates, right? So the question, I think, in putting Babbitt and Tocqueville together is there a magnanimity that is also humble, right? Is it possible to seek to do and be great things in the world without either overestimating one's own capacities and thereby failing, or getting sucked into this dynamic of the libido dominandi that both of them warn against. So thank you very much. That's what I had prepared. I think we'll go to some questions from Morgan now.
Great, Luke. Yeah, I have a few questions here, and then feel free to submit any further questions in the Q&A box. So the first question, Luke, I'd like to start off with is a question on Tocqueville and Babbitt. So your presentation, you were arguing that both of them are kind of critiquing Wilsonianism, but Tocqueville is also advocating a bit more foreign intervention, I would say, right, than Babbitt is, making him kind of a Huntingtonian in today's terms. What would you consider the primary distinctions to be between Wilsonianism, the Wilsonianism that he's critiquing, and the Huntingtonianism that he's advocating? Is it just this hubris that you were hinting at the end, or are there more distinctions?
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot one could say on this, and of course, it's a bit. There's always the danger of anachronism, right? By taking Tocqueville's kind of political interventions in the 1840s, Babbitt's in the 1920s, and trying to find a coherent position for our own concerns today. So with that caveat, I would say the big differences I see are that Wilsonianism has the characteristic tendency to view the impulse to democracy as, I think, innate, right? As something that all people or all peoples aspire to, in principle, even if they don't know that they do. And so if external constraints were removed, Wilson's thinking about these old crumbling empires of, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian. If those things were removed, then democracies would spring up, right? And I'm sure this is a bit unfair to the nuance of Wilson's own thought, but that's certainly kind of what the Wilsonian position has come to be seen as. And I think this did influence, right, certainly the kind of failures that Duran is talking about in Afghanistan, right? The assumption of the main thing to be done is remove the Taliban, right? The main thing to be done is remove the undemocratic, tyrannical current ruler, and then democracy will follow naturally. And I think Tocqueville in particular is helpful there, because he helps to point to the ways in which actually even the most flourishing and successful democracies that we're familiar with took centuries through a very delicate, long process to develop their institutions, and they're fragile and they could be lost at any time. And so there's not some sort of innate inevitability to the democratic to a democratic regime being successful. The other thing I think is that that Huntington at least is worried about with regard to Wilson is that there's a kind of a contradiction, or at least profound tension, between individual and group rights in Wilson. So Wilson talks about self-determination of peoples as a kind of the core principle of international legitimacy, right? Every time there's a kind of identifiable ethno-linguistic group, they should be in principle, they should be able to express their aspirations to nationhood by being sovereign and independent. This, of course, in practice, often leads to terrible repression or even ethnic cleansing between different groups, right? It doesn't seem very it doesn't really take into account the ways in which group boundaries and group memberships are hard to draw. There can be very serious practical obstacles, which are also ethical objections to self-determination, right? So I think the Huntingtonian view would be to say, it's not enough to want to be an independent democracy. It's not enough to just be a people. You also have to have conditions like the rule of law, like a functioning state, territorial integrity, etc. And so that approach would add a lot more conditions to thinking about legitimate claims, I think. I could ramble on, but that's to hopefully an answer to begin with.
Thank you so much, Luke. That's really interesting. Our next question is, Tocqueville talks about the importance of familiarity with great works of Greek and Roman culture. And I assume that Babbitt, as a classics professor, would agree with this point. Would these thinkers also consider it important to be familiar with the great works of the culture with which one is engaging in foreign policy?
Yeah, so I think unquestionably so. And Babbitt's kind of great side interest, actually, in his academic career was in Buddhist philosophy, and did a lot to kind of bring the serious study of Buddhism to American academia. And one of his kind of biggest frustrations with the Wilsonian project is its lack of attention to kind of serious kind of rival ethical traditions in the East. So that's one area. The other, I mean, in Tocqueville's own work on Algeria, it's very interesting that he drew up a kind of detailed commentary on the Quran. He was very interested in trying to understand principles of Islamic law, Islamic theology, through textual work. And so I think, at least, even though if it's under theorized, it's at least exemplified in their actions. The last kind of comment I want to make on that important question is William de Barry, who was one of my teachers as an undergrad, and was one of the great Confucianists in America basically in the last 70 years. And he always said the danger of study abroad programs is that you wind up going to the same clubs and listening to the same American pop music in a foreign capital as you would in your hometown, right? There's a kind of it can teach a kind of shallow homogenizing global monoculture. And his point was the reason to study the great works of your own tradition is precisely so that you can become aware of your own assumptions and biases, and then you can actually read the kind of the deep thought of a different culture well, right? And he was partly saying that in the context of the Vietnam War, which he also viewed in kind of Babbittian terms as a failure to engage at something deeper than the technocratic level.
Thank you, Luke. That's very helpful. Our next question is just I guess a synthesis of the argument that you're making, but through the lens of disagreement, right? So where do we see a disagreement between Tocqueville and Babbitt on foreign policy? Or do you think that their views could potentially be harmonized in the magnanimity that is also humble that you mentioned at the end of your talk?
Yeah, so I mean, that synthesis is kind of ultimately what I'm arguing for, and I think the ingredients for it are there in each of them. But there definitely are some differences. And I mean, at the first level, right, I think Babbitt definitely doesn't emphasize this kind of human need for greatness nearly as much, right? He talks about, against the will to power, he talks about the will to refrain, or the inner check, a great deal, right? So he's really worried about this kind of expansive self that's possible, made possible in a kind of individualistic democratic society, and he places the emphasis there. And so his kind of circumspect hope is that a few people, through deep acquaintance with old books, might acquire this kind of skepticism towards that, which is pretty, maybe isn't a principal disagreement with Tocqueville, but it's definitely a difference of emphasis. The deeper disagreement, I think, might be explained by just the historical shift between the 1840s and the 1920s. Tocqueville is from an old aristocratic family in Normandy. He did run for the National Assembly, stood for election, but in his day, it was still very customary for local people in the countryside to vote for their local aristocrat. Right? I forget the exact share of the vote he had, but it was something like over 90%. Right? And so Tocqueville kind of assumes, I think, a certain deference, a certain respect for classical learning, for kind of eloquence and polish, rhetoric, as still being a force in democratic life. Right? He talks about great speeches in the British Parliament or in the American Congress. He's visiting America in the age of Daniel Webster and Henry Clay. These sort of giants whose rhetoric really in the Senate really had a kind of consequential political effect. And it seems to me that Babbitt just doesn't think that's going to be possible in the kind of era of mass media and instant communication that he's seeing begin in the 20s. And I'm not sure which of them is right about that. I think Babbitt's position that, the characteristic kind of elite leadership we're likely to see now is technocracy does seem pretty well borne out in practice.
Right. Our next question comes from Dennis Teddy, who writes, "Thank you. You haven't talked about the ideology of the administrative state, something which Tocqueville anticipated to some extent. To understand current foreign policy, for instance, in Afghanistan, you need to see it in light of creating a rules-based international order, which means a globalized administrative state, which is the goal of our foreign policy elites. In talking about France extending liberal ideas everywhere, was Tocqueville advocating something like this or something quite different?"
Yeah, so thank you. It's a great question, and there's a number of different layers to it. I think part of what I'm doing provocatively here by drawing on Tocqueville and the Algerian case is a kind of consciousness raising, right? That very often, at least, maybe inherently, American foreign policy is imperial, right? And it has, therefore, I think, all of the temptations and potential downsides of empire. And we often use terms like the rules-based international order as kind of euphemisms for essentially, with some hiccups here and there along the way, what has been since World War II an American-driven international order, which really raises the question of how international is it after all, right? If it takes the threat of F-16s and American frigates to enforce it, is it really something that everybody would just spontaneously do, right? As for the administrative state or the dangers of administration, and as you point to, Dennis, Tocqueville talks about this in the context of what he calls administrative despotism in democracy in America. This is actually a major worry for his about Algerian policy and French colonial policy more generally. He thinks France, for historical reasons, has a reflexively centralized bureaucracy based in Paris, and doesn't devolve power out from that well at all. So he has some interesting pieces sort of highlighting the corruption and inefficiency of trying to run everything by even in distant colonies from Paris, and calling in a way that I think is very actually similar to Adam Smith's view of the American colonies and the problems that would lead to the American Revolution. Tocqueville wants a kind of devolved power as much as possible, where local authorities can make local decisions. Now, of course, in the context of Algeria, this was very, very complicated because there was a French settler population, and there were there were Arab inhabitants, but also Berbers and Jews, different groups with very different mores in Tocquevillian terms. So Tocqueville actually called for a kind of decentralized legal system in Algeria, where he wanted essentially French law, Jewish law, and Islamic law to each kind of have parallel jurisdictions. This certainly would have been no panacea for the eventual, a century later, the eventual failure of the Algerian colony. But it does show, I think, a kind of attention to this problem of you can't govern distant peripheries with a one-size-fits-all policy from a central bureaucracy.
Thank you, Luke. We have about 10 more minutes for questions. So if you have any final questions for Luke, you can go ahead and submit them in the Q&A. The next question has to do with the article that you mentioned at the beginning concerning Afghanistan. The author of the article spoke of the task of building a civil society through foreign policy. Speaking for Babbitt and perhaps Tocqueville, would this, well, I guess in this case, it would primarily be Tocqueville who would be concerned with something like this. But would this civil society include liberal education? How would the liberal education in another nation look similar to or different from the education of our own foreign policy elites?
Yeah, it's a profound question, because part of what I've been arguing for is two sides of the cave allegory in Plato's Republic, which is, I think, often rightly taken to be a kind of foundational statement of the vision of liberal education, right? So liberal education has this way of, when done well, of inviting people into questioning whether the kind of received opinions, the commonplaces of their time and their culture are actually true, real by nature, in touch with something beyond kind of mere convention. Right? And so Plato describes this as a process of kind of climbing out of the shackles in the shadows of the cave to see the true light of the sun and perceive the world on its own terms. This has a kind of perilous quality for politics and for the kind of judgments that foreign policymakers have to make, right? Which is that you might think it makes people potentially disloyal, too interested in the universal, too interested in the human, what's true everywhere for everyone, and not interested enough in, our particular country, our particular tradition, the need to protect and serve those people, right? So that's one side of the one danger of liberal education that I've been trying to say. Actually, liberal learning done well involves not just this aspiration to the universal, but also a kind of rootedness or groundedness in a particular context as well, and an ability to say, it's not an absolute loyalty, but there is a legitimate loyalty to one's own country, right? And so that is, I think, the piece that perhaps American foreign policymakers need. They need more awareness of the particularity of America and of its traditions and institutions, the ways in which they're fragile, the ways in which they aren't obvious to everyone, and they take preserving, right? So that's the piece I'm arguing for there. But in a context like Afghanistan, what I think Durand's article points towards is the other side of liberal education, right? At least as he describes the Afghan situation, loyalties are very, very local, intensely local, right? People tend to only trust extended kinship groups, people they know or related to, because there isn't a functioning state, there isn't a rule of law, there doesn't seem like much reason to trust people from the neighboring village, much less the other side of the country. Right? And this, part of Durand's point is this leads to bloody fratricidal conflict. This makes it very hard to put together a kind of peaceful, decent society. Even if, from the perspective of each individual actor, it makes sense to be very reluctant to trust others, trust outsiders. So in that kind of context, I think the universal piece of liberal education, of course, among many other ingredients to making a healthy civil society, but that universality could be valuable, right? Being able to come out of one's own conventions and think about what is true everywhere as a potential, and that might help to build loyalty on a larger scale.
Thank you, Luke. We have a minute for one more question. This is from Fritz Heinzen, I'm sorry. And he's asking essentially whether we can take Durand's piece, which was kind of framed in the context of the American experience in Afghanistan, and if we can apply the insights of Durand's piece to this multi-decade effort led by 16 different generals from 7 nations, leading troops from 30 different countries. And I think a kind of interesting way to frame this question would just be whether we think that your talk and Durand's piece is speaking to the exclusively American context, or whether these insights are kind of more broadly applicable to all foreign policy elites.
Yeah, no, thank you. And it's a serious objection. And I certainly don't want to paint with too broad a brush. I do think the experience of the different allied forces in Afghanistan are each quite different. The jumping off point really for me was the dramatic nature of the Afghan failure in a way, as opposed to taking a case like Iraq or some of the other American foreign policy efforts in recent decades. I think it's more clear cut, right, to the extent to which American objectives were never achieved, right? Because even the most basic objective of defeating the Taliban clearly failed, right? It's harder to draw up a balance sheet, I think, about the long-term health of civil society, respect for human rights, et cetera. And so just the fact of, well, the capital city is now reoccupied by the very force that the invasion was supposed to defeat, is a kind of a clearer marker of, well, something clearly went wrong here. So that's why I used it. It's not to say that all these cases are the same at all. But I do think, and this is maybe a Tocquevillian point, insofar as America is maybe the quintessential liberal democratic society in the world today and the most powerful state, it does have this kind of symbolic significance, right? And perhaps this kind of unique tendency to equate its own conventions, to go back to the cave allegory, its own conventions with what is universally true. And so I do think, even compared to other Western democratic countries like Canada or France that you mentioned, Fritz, I think maybe these are particularly acute challenges for Americans. But thank you for the mention of Loeffler's book, and I'll definitely look into that.
Well, I think that's all the time that we have for today. I really appreciate your being here, Luke, for this very interesting presentation and for the Q&A. And on behalf of the Institute for Human Ecology, I'd like to thank you all for attending.
Thanks very much, Morgan, and thanks to everyone for being here.